My name is Phyllis, and I'm 58 years old. For 20 years, I raised my son Marcus alone after my husband passed away when our boy was just 8. Through sleepless nights and countless sacrifices, I watched him grow into a man I thought I knew. 3 weeks ago, I received what should have been the most joyful news a mother could hear. Marcus was getting married to Stephanie, the woman he'd been dating for 2 years. I should have been over the moon. Instead, there was something about the way he delivered the news that made my heart skip a beat. Not from joy, but from worry. Before I share what happened next, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life stories. Trust me, you'll want to hear how this mother-son relationship took an unexpected turn. When Marcus was 8, and his father died suddenly from a heart attack, I made a promise at that graveside. I would do whatever it took to give my son the life his father would have wanted for him. That promise cost me everything I thought I valued, but gave me everything that truly mattered. I sold our 4-bedroom house in the suburbs and moved us into a tiny 2-bedroom apartment. I worked 3 jobs. Mornings at the local diner, afternoons cleaning offices, and evenings catering small events from our cramped kitchen. The diner shifts were brutal. 4 in the morning until noon, serving coffee and eggs to construction workers and night shift nurses heading home. My feet ached constantly, and the smell of bacon grease seemed permanently embedded in my hair. But the tips were decent, and the regular customers became like family. They watched Marcus grow up through the stories I shared during slow periods, celebrating his good grades and offering encouragement during difficult times. The office cleaning job was solitary work, which I actually appreciated after dealing with demanding customers all morning. 3 buildings downtown, emptying trash cans, vacuuming carpets, and scrubbing bathrooms until they sparkled. The work was physically demanding, but it gave me time to think and plan. I would spend those quiet evening hours mapping out Marcus's future, calculating how much money I needed to save for his college fund, and dreaming about the opportunities that education would provide him. Marcus never complained about our reduced circumstances, even when his friends had video games and brand-name clothes that we couldn't afford. He seemed to understand instinctively that we were a team fighting against the world together. After school, he would help me pack the small containers of food I prepared for my weekend catering clients. His little hands carefully placing garnishes on appetizer trays, while I rushed between the stove and the sink, preparing meals for garden parties and small business events. Those were some of our best moments. Just the 2 of us working side by side, building something from nothing. My catering business started almost by accident when a neighbor tasted my homemade lasagna at a potluck dinner and asked if I would cater her daughter's graduation party. Word spread slowly through our community, and soon I was handling birthday celebrations, anniversary dinners, and small corporate events. The work was exhausting, especially since I was doing all the cooking, serving, and cleanup myself, but it paid better than my other jobs and gave me hope for a more sustainable future. By the time Marcus turned 16, my small catering business had grown enough that I could quit the diner and the cleaning service. The transition wasn't easy. Losing the steady paychecks from those jobs meant relying entirely on the unpredictable income from catering events. But it also meant I could focus my energy on building something that might eventually provide real financial security for both of us. I poured every penny I earned back into Marcus's future, viewing my own comfort and security as secondary to his opportunities. When he wanted to take advanced placement classes that required expensive textbooks, I sold my grandmother's pearl necklace and matching earrings, the only valuable jewelry I owned. When he had the opportunity to attend a summer program at a prestigious university that would strengthen his college applications, I worked double shifts for 3 months straight to afford the program fees and dormitory costs. Every sacrifice felt worthwhile when I saw how these experiences were shaping him into a confident, articulate young man with limitless potential. The day Marcus graduated high school as valedictorian, I sat in the auditorium wearing a dress I had bought at a thrift store, but had carefully altered and pressed until it looked almost new. When they called his name and he walked across that stage to accept his diploma and scholarship awards, I cried harder than I had since his father's funeral. but these were tears of joy and pride and overwhelming relief. My boy had made it. All those years of struggle and sacrifice had led to this moment of triumph. He was going to have the future his father and I had dreamed of for him. Marcus graduated college with a degree in business administration and landed a job at a respected consulting firm in the city, making more money in his first year than I had made in any 3 years combined. I was so proud of his success and relieved that he would never have to worry about money the way we had during his childhood. That's when he met Stephanie at some corporate networking event, and everything in our relationship began to change in ways I didn't understand at first. When Marcus first brought Stephanie home for dinner 2 years ago, I tried so hard to make a good impression. I spent days planning the menu, choosing dishes that would showcase my cooking skills without seeming too elaborate or pretentious. I prepared my famous herb-crusted salmon roasted vegetables from the farmer's market and a homemade chocolate tart that had always been Marcus's favorite. I cleaned our small apartment until it sparkled, bought fresh flowers for the table, and even invested in new cloth napkins to replace the paper ones we normally used. Stephanie was polite but distant throughout the evening. She complimented the food graciously but barely touched any of it, claiming she was watching her carbohydrate intake. She asked about my catering business with what seemed like genuine interest, but I caught her checking her phone several times during our conversation and glancing around our modest living space with an expression I couldn't quite interpret. When Marcus walked her to her car after dinner, they stood talking in the parking lot for almost 20 minutes, and I wondered what they were discussing so intensely. 6 months later, Marcus arranged for us all to have dinner with Stephanie's parents at an upscale restaurant downtown. The Belmont Club was the kind of place I had only seen in magazines, with white tablecloths, crystal wine glasses, and a wine list that cost more than my monthly grocery budget. I remember feeling so out of place in my best dress, which suddenly seemed shabby compared to Stephanie's mother's designer outfit and professionally styled hair. Her father wore a suit that probably cost more than I made in a month, and both parents spoke with the casual confidence that comes from a lifetime of financial security. Her father talked about their vacation home in the Hamptons and their recent trip to Europe, dropping names of exclusive resorts and Michelin-starred restaurants as if such experiences were perfectly ordinary. Her mother discussed the charity boards she served on and the fundraising events she organized, moving effortlessly between conversations about $1,000 per plate dinners and private art collections. When they asked about my work, I explained my catering business with pride, describing some of my signature dishes and regular clients, only to watch Stephanie's mother's smile tighten at the corners, and her father change the subject rather abruptly. The evening ended with polite goodbyes and promises to get together again soon, but I could feel their judgment lingering in the air, like expensive perfume. During the drive home, Marcus was unusually quiet, and when I asked if everything was all right, he assured me that dinner had gone well and that Stephanie's parents had enjoyed meeting me. But something in his tone suggested otherwise, and I began to worry that I had somehow embarrassed him or failed to meet their expectations. The engagement happened last Christmas during a family gathering at Stephanie's parents' house. Marcus called to tell me the news, and I could hear the happiness and excitement in his voice. I was thrilled for him, of course, genuinely excited that he had found someone who made him so happy. But something felt different about our conversation. It was shorter than usual, more formal, somehow lacking the easy intimacy that had always characterized our relationship. When I asked about wedding plans and whether they had set a date, he said Stephanie was handling everything and that they wanted to keep the celebration small and intimate. I offered to help with the catering, thinking it would be a wonderful way to contribute to their special day and to feel included in such an important milestone. I suggested that we could work together to plan a menu that reflected both families' favorite foods, creating a celebration that was both elegant and personal. Marcus declined quickly, saying Stephanie had already hired a professional catering company and that everything was under control. When I pressed gently for more details about their plans, he became evasive and said they were still working out the logistics. As the months passed, I found myself increasingly shut out of the wedding preparations. When I called to ask about engagement party plans, thinking I could offer to host something simple at my apartment, Marcus told me they had decided against having an engagement celebration. When I suggested we could go dress shopping together, so I could help Stephanie choose her gown and maybe find something appropriate for myself to wear, he said. Her mother was taking care of all the dress shopping and that they preferred to keep it small. Every attempt I made to be involved was met with polite but firm resistance. I offered to help address invitations, research photographers, scout venues, arrange flowers, anything that would make me feel like I was part of this exciting process. But Marcus had an explanation for why my help wasn't needed for every single suggestion. The wedding planner was handling invitations. Stephanie's family had connections with all the best vendors. They had already booked everything months in advance. Our weekly phone calls, which had been a treasured tradition since Marcus left for college, became shorter and less frequent. Marcus, who used to share every detail of his life with me, suddenly seemed to be living in a world I wasn't welcome to enter. When I asked direct questions about the wedding date or venue, he gave vague answers about things still being planned and details still being finalized. I began to suspect that the wedding was much more elaborate than the small, intimate ceremony he had originally described. 3 months before the wedding, I tried a different approach. I called Marcus at work and asked if he and Stephanie would like to have dinner at my apartment, just the 3 of us. I thought maybe in a more intimate setting away from the pressures of wedding planning, we could reconnect, and I could build a better relationship with my future daughter-in-law. I promised to cook all of Marcus's childhood favorites and suggested we could look at old photo albums and share family stories that would help Stephanie feel more connected to our history. Marcus hesitated for so long, I thought the call had dropped. Finally, he said they were too busy with wedding preparations and work commitments, but maybe after the honeymoon we could plan something like that. His tone was apologetic but distant, and I could hear typing in the background, as if he was multitasking during our conversation. When I suggested that surely they could find one evening in 3 months for a simple family dinner, he became defensive and said I didn't understand how stressful wedding planning could be. That's when the full weight of what was happening hit me. I wasn't just being excluded from wedding planning. I was being excluded from my son's life entirely. The boy I had sacrificed everything for, who had been my best friend and closest companion for 20 years, was slipping away from me, and there seemed to be nothing I could do to stop it. Every conversation ended with promises that we would spend time together after the wedding, but I was beginning to doubt that those promises were sincere. Still, I held on to hope. I told myself that once the wedding stress was over, things would return to normal. I convinced myself that Stephanie just wanted their wedding to be perfect and didn't want too many opinions complicating things. I made excuses for my son's behavior because accepting the alternative was too painful to bear. This was just a temporary phase, I reasoned. Once they were settled into married life, Marcus would remember how important our relationship was and make an effort to include me in their lives. 2 weeks before the wedding, Marcus finally called with concrete details. The ceremony would be at the Grandview Hotel at 4 o'clock on Saturday afternoon. He gave me the address and said he would see me there. The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes. No mention of rehearsal dinners or bachelor parties or any of the other traditional pre-wedding events. No questions about what I might wear or whether I needed help with transportation. No discussion of seating arrangements or family photos, or any of the details that I assumed would be coordinated in advance. Just the basic facts delivered in the tone of voice he might use with a distant acquaintance. I spent the remaining 2 weeks preparing carefully. I bought the most beautiful dress I could afford from a boutique that catered to special occasions, spending more money than I typically spent on clothing in 6 months. I made an appointment to have my hair styled professionally, something I hadn't done since Marcus's college graduation. I researched the hotel online, studying photos of their event spaces so I would know what to expect and feel more confident in such elegant surroundings. Most importantly, I prepared a special wedding gift. I created a photo album chronicling Marcus's life From infancy to adulthood, carefully selecting pictures that told the story of his growth and achievements. Pictures of his first steps, his first day of school, birthday parties, Christmas mornings, graduation ceremonies, all the moments we had shared together over the years. I wrote a heartfelt note about how proud I was of the man he had become and how excited I was to welcome Stephanie into our family. I hoped the album would serve as a bridge between our past and their future, helping Stephanie understand the depth of love that had shaped Marcus into the person she fell in love with. The Grandview Hotel was even more elegant than I had imagined from the website photos. The circular driveway was lined with luxury cars, Mercedes and BMWs and vehicles I didn't even recognize, and uniformed valets moved efficiently between them with the practiced ease of people accustomed to handling expensive automobiles. I handed over my modest sedan to a young man who looked like he made more money in tips than I made in catering fees, some weeks feeling suddenly self-conscious about the age and condition of my car. The lobby was all marble floors and crystal chandeliers filled with well-dressed guests who seemed to belong in such surroundings. Women in designer dresses chatted comfortably, while men in perfectly tailored suits checked their phones and adjusted expensive watches. Everyone looked like they had stepped out of a magazine spread about luxury living, and I felt increasingly aware of how different I was from this crowd, despite my careful preparation. I approached the registration table expecting to receive some sort of program or seating assignment that would help orient me to the evening's schedule. The young woman behind the table, impeccably dressed and professionally polite, scanned her list twice before looking up at me with confusion. She asked my name again, checked with her supervisor, and then consulted what appeared to be a master guest list before finally directing me to the general seating area. No special designation as mother of the groom. No reserved seat in the front row. No escort to help me navigate the venue. Just general admission like any other guest. The ceremony space was breathtaking, decorated with an abundance of white roses and lilies that must have cost more than my monthly rent. Soft classical music played from hidden speakers throughout the room, and professional photographers moved discreetly around the perimeter, capturing every elegant detail. The altar was framed by towering arrangements of flowers and greenery that created a romantic garden atmosphere indoors. Everything was perfect, beautiful, and obviously expensive. I found a seat toward the back, trying not to notice how the front rows were reserved for what I assumed were Stephanie's family members and closest friends. Important-looking people in expensive clothing chatted quietly among themselves, while photographers captured their every smile and gesture. Several women wore jewelry that probably cost more than my annual income, and the men all had the confident bearing of people accustomed to success and social prominence. As the ceremony time approached, I watched a steady stream of elegantly dressed guests fill the front sections of the seating area. They greeted each other with the familiarity of people who attended the same country clubs and charity events, discussing mutual acquaintances and shared experiences with easy intimacy. I recognized none of them, and it became increasingly clear that Marcus's life had expanded far beyond anything I was part of or even aware of. When Marcus appeared at the altar in his black tuxedo, my heart swelled with pride despite everything. He looked so handsome, so mature, so much like his father on our own wedding day 29 years ago. For a moment, all my hurt and confusion disappeared, replaced by the simple joy of seeing my child grown into a successful, confident man. But when his eyes scanned the crowd, they passed right over me without acknowledgement. It was as if I were invisible, just another face in a sea of strangers. The processional began with a parade of bridesmaids in expensive gowns, followed by flower girls and ring bearers who looked like they had stepped out of a fairy tale. Finally, Stephanie appeared absolutely stunning in her elaborate designer gown, walking down the aisle on her father's arm, while the string quartet played something classical and romantic. She was undeniably beautiful, radiant with happiness and confidence, the perfect bride for such a perfect celebration. The ceremony was beautiful and formal, conducted by a minister who spoke eloquently about love and commitment and the joining of two families. He talked about the importance of building a strong foundation for marriage, about honoring the people who had shaped the bride and groom into the individuals they had become, about creating new traditions while respecting family heritage. But as I listened to his words about the joining of two families, I realized that only one family was truly being represented here. During the reception that followed, I felt increasingly like an intruder at someone else's celebration. The cocktail hour featured an elaborate bar service and passed appetizers that showcased the kind of culinary artistry I could only dream of achieving. Professional servers circulated constantly, ensuring that every guest had whatever they needed, while a jazz ensemble provided sophisticated background music that created the perfect atmosphere for socializing. The dinner was exquisite, served by an army of waitstaff at elegantly appointed tables that featured crystal glassware, fine china, and floral centerpieces that rivaled anything I had seen in wedding magazines. Multiple courses arrived perfectly timed and beautifully presented, each dish more impressive than the last. But I found myself seated at the very last table near the kitchen doors with people I didn't recognize and who seemed equally puzzled by my presence. No one introduced me as the mother of the groom. No one asked me to share stories about Marcus's childhood or his journey to this happy day. When other guests asked how I knew the couple, I explained that Marcus was my son, which was usually met with polite surprise and then awkward silence. It became clear that most people had no idea Marcus even had a mother, or at least not one who would be attending his wedding. The worst moment came during the toasts. Stephanie's father spoke beautifully about his daughter and welcomed Marcus into their family, praising his character and accomplishments and expressing confidence in their future together. Marcus responded with his own speech, thanking Stephanie's parents for their love and support, praising his new wife's many qualities, and expressing gratitude to all the friends who had made their day so special. He spoke eloquently about the importance of family and the blessing of being surrounded by people who cared about their happiness. He never once mentioned me. 20 years of single motherhood, of sacrifice and struggle and unwavering support, and I didn't merit even a passing acknowledgement. Not a word about the woman who had raised him, who had worked multiple jobs to pay for his education, who had given up everything to ensure his success. It was as if those years had never happened, as if he had somehow achieved everything on his own, without any help or support from anyone. I sat there fighting back tears, watching my son celebrate the most important day of his life as if I didn't exist. The boy I had raised, the man I had loved more than my own life, had essentially erased me from his history. As the evening wore on and the dancing began, couples swayed to romantic music while I sat alone at my table, feeling more isolated and forgotten than I ever had in my life. I decided I had to at least try to connect with Marcus before leaving. Whatever had gone wrong between us, surely on his wedding day, we could find a way back to each other. Maybe in person, away from the crowd and the pressure, I could remind him of our bond and help him understand how much his rejection was hurting me. I gathered my courage and approached the head table where Marcus and Stephanie were sitting with her parents, carrying the photo album I had prepared so carefully. The walk across the reception hall felt like the longest journey of my life. I was acutely aware of every step, every curious glance from other guests, every detail of the elegant surroundings that seemed designed to make me feel out of place. By the time I reached the head table, my heart was beating so fast I could hear it in my ears, but I forced myself to smile and tried to project confidence I didn't feel. Marcus saw me coming, and I watched his expression change from mild confusion to something that looked almost like panic. He said something quietly to Stephanie, who immediately tensed up and began whispering urgently in his ear. Her parents noticed the exchange and turned to see what was causing the disturbance. As I got closer, I could see Marcus shaking his head slightly, and my heart began to sink even before I reached them. I reached their table and smiled as brightly as I could manage, determined to make this interaction positive regardless of their obvious reluctance to see me. I said hello and congratulations, trying to keep my voice steady and cheerful despite the cold reception I was receiving. I held out the photo album and began to explain what it was, hoping that seeing those pictures of his childhood would soften his heart somehow and remind him of all the love we had shared. But instead of the warm reaction I was hoping for, Marcus stood up abruptly and said in a voice loud enough for nearby tables to hear, "Mom, what are you doing here?" The question hit me like a physical blow. The tone wasn't one of surprise or delight at seeing me, but rather annoyance and embarrassment. I stammered something about being his mother, and of course I would be at his wedding, but he cut me off before I could finish explaining. "I told you this was a small, intimate ceremony," he said, his voice getting louder and more agitated with each word. "You weren't supposed to come." I was completely stunned. I tried to explain that he had given me the time and location, that I had assumed I was invited, that I had spent weeks preparing for this day, but my explanations only seemed to make him more uncomfortable and frustrated. Stephanie leaned forward and said in a tight, controlled voice, "This is supposed to be our special day." Her tone carried an unmistakable edge of accusation, as if my presence was somehow ruining everything they had planned. Her parents were watching the entire exchange with expressions of shocked disapproval, clearly appalled that such a scene was unfolding at their daughter's elegant wedding. The conversation escalated quickly from there. Marcus told me I was making everyone uncomfortable and asked me to please just leave. I looked around and realized that indeed people were staring. Conversations at nearby tables had stopped, and I could feel the weight of dozens of curious and disapproving glances. Some guests were openly gawking at the spectacle, while others pretended to look away while still listening intently to every word. The humiliation was overwhelming, but what hurt more than anything was the look of embarrassment on my son's face. Not embarrassment for how he was treating me, but embarrassment that I was there at all. This was the child I had devoted my life to raising, and he was looking at me like I was some unwanted intruder who had crashed his party uninvited. I placed the photo album on their table and said as quietly and calmly as I could manage that it was for him pictures of his life growing up, memories of all the moments we had shared together. But Marcus didn't even look at it. He just repeated his request that I leave his voice now, carrying an edge of desperation. He was clearly mortified that this confrontation was happening in front of Stephanie's family and their important guests. With as much dignity as I could muster, I said goodbye and walked out of that beautiful ballroom, through the elegant lobby and out to the parking lot, where I sat in my car and cried harder than I had since the day my husband died. 20 years of devotion and sacrifice had led to this moment of absolute rejection and humiliation. My son, the person I loved most in the world, had chosen his new life over any connection to his past, and that past apparently included me. I drove home in a fog of hurt and disbelief, replaying the evening's events over and over in my mind. Each time, I remembered Marcus's words, and the look of embarrassment on his face. The pain cut deeper. I had lost my son, not to death or distance, but to his own deliberate choice to erase me from his life. The apartment felt smaller and lonelier than it ever had before, filled with memories of the boy who no longer seemed to remember or value our shared history. For 2 hours, I sat in my living room in the dress I had chosen so carefully, still wearing the jewelry I had polished specially for the occasion. I felt completely numb, unable to process what had just happened or figure out what to do next. The photo album I had worked on for weeks was still sitting on their table, probably discarded or ignored, like everything else about our past that Marcus seemed eager to forget. That's when I decided to check my bank account, partly out of habit, and partly because I needed something concrete and normal to focus on. It was a routine I had maintained for years, monitoring my finances carefully to ensure I could cover my modest expenses and continue building the small emergency fund that provided my only sense of security. But what I found there changed everything and shifted my perspective on the entire evening's events. My online banking showed several large pending transactions on the credit card I had given Marcus years ago for emergencies. The card I had intended for true crises like medical bills or car repairs, not for personal expenses. Transactions that totaled $47,000 more money than I had ever seen move through my account at one time. The wedding venue, the catering company, the florist, the photographer, the string quartet I had admired so much, even the hotel charges for what I assumed was their honeymoon suite. Everything had been charged to my credit card. I scrolled through the charges in growing amazement and fury, recognizing the names of all the vendors I had seen working at the reception. The elaborate flower arrangements that had transformed the ceremony space, the gourmet meal that had been served to hundreds of guests, the professional photography and videography services that had documented every moment, the live music that had provided entertainment throughout the evening. Every single element of the small, intimate ceremony that I wasn't welcome to attend had been funded entirely by the mother who was told she didn't belong there. The betrayal was complete now. Not only had Marcus rejected and humiliated me in front of all those people, but he had been lying to me for months about the wedding finances. While telling me that Stephanie's family was taking care of everything, while declining my offers to help with catering or other expenses, he had been quietly racking up enormous charges on my credit card. The card I had given him when he was in college for true emergencies, which he had kept and apparently felt free to use whenever it suited him. I sat there staring at the numbers on my screen, and something inside me shifted. The hurt and grief I had been feeling transformed into something else entirely. Something clearer and stronger and more purposeful. If Marcus wanted to treat me like I didn't exist, if he wanted to exclude me from his life while taking my money, then perhaps it was time to show him what my absence actually meant. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same son who had been embarrassed by my modest background and small apartment had no problem using my credit card to pay for his elaborate wedding to impress his new in-laws. He was ashamed of where he came from, but not too proud to rely on the financial resources that came from the years of hard work and sacrifice he seemed eager to forget. I called my bank first. The customer service representative was very helpful when I explained that I needed to stop payment on several unauthorized transactions. Yes, my son had access to the card, but no, I had not given permission for these particular charges. The amounts were so large that they required supervisory approval to reverse, but within 30 minutes, every single wedding-related payment was frozen pending investigation. Next, I started calling the vendors directly. I had their names and phone numbers from the charges on my statement, and most of them had after-hours emergency contact information for exactly these kinds of situations. I explained to each of them that there had been a significant error with the payment processing for the Marcus Thompson wedding, and that they should expect some complications with their billing procedures. I was careful not to say anything untrue, but I made sure they understood that payment was no longer guaranteed. By the time I finished making those calls, I felt calmer and more clear-headed than I had in months. For the first time since this whole wedding ordeal began, I had taken action instead of just accepting whatever treatment I received. It felt good to have some control over the situation again, to demonstrate that my resources were not automatically available to people who treated me with disrespect and dishonesty. 3 hours after I left the wedding reception, my phone started ringing with a persistence that made it impossible to ignore. The first call was from Marcus, and I could hear the panic in his voice before he even finished saying hello. He asked what I had done, and I told him calmly that I had protected my financial security. When he started explaining about vendor calls and threats to shut down services, I reminded him that maybe he should have thought about payment arrangements before telling me I wasn't welcome at his wedding. The conversation that followed was unlike any we had ever had. Marcus pleaded with me to reverse the payment stops, promising that he would pay me back with interest, and that this was all a misunderstanding. I asked him to explain exactly what part was misunderstood. Was it misunderstood that he had charged $47,000 to my credit card without my explicit permission? Or was it misunderstood that he told me to leave his wedding while I was paying for it? When Marcus couldn't answer those questions coherently, when he started making excuses about pressure and expectations and how complicated the situation was, I realized that he still didn't understand the fundamental issue. This wasn't about money, although the financial betrayal was serious. This was about respect, honesty, and the basic consideration that any human being deserves, especially from their own child. Stephanie grabbed the phone from him at that point, her voice shrill with panic as she demanded to know what I thought I was doing. She accused me of trying to ruin their perfect day out of jealousy and spite, claiming that I was acting like a vindictive ex-wife rather than a loving mother. I told her very calmly that she had gotten exactly what she wanted: a wedding without me present. The only difference was that it would also be a wedding without me paying for it. The calls continued for the next hour, each one more frantic than the last. First, the florist explaining that the flower arrangements were being repossessed due to payment issues and that their crew was on the way to remove everything immediately. Then the photographer, who had been told to stop shooting because his contract was in dispute and who was packing up his equipment despite the fact that the reception was still in progress. The caterer called to say that the late-night snack service had been canceled, and they would be removing their equipment early, leaving the guests without the midnight buffet that had been promised. Even the hotel called to confirm that the honeymoon suite reservation was being canceled due to credit card problems, and that the happy couple would need to make alternative arrangements for their wedding night. The wedding cake, which hadn't been cut yet, was technically being repossessed by the bakery, although they agreed to leave it until the end of the evening out of consideration for the guests who were still celebrating. Each call Marcus received made him more frantic and desperate. He kept calling me back, trying different approaches with increasing desperation. First anger, demanding that I fix the situation immediately and threatening to never speak to me again if I didn't reverse my decision. Then bargaining, promising to pay me back with interest if I would just restore the payments and allow the vendors to continue their services. Then pleading, saying I was destroying the most important day of his life and that he would never forgive me for this betrayal. Finally, something that sounded almost like recognition of what he had done wrong. It was during that last conversation around midnight that Marcus finally admitted he had made a terrible mistake. He said he never meant to hurt me, that he had been under so much pressure from Stephanie and her family to have the perfect wedding that met their social expectations. He explained that Stephanie had been embarrassed by our modest lifestyle and worried that my presence would reflect poorly on her in front of her wealthy relatives and important friends. But here's what struck me most about that admission. Even in his apology, Marcus was making excuses. He was blaming Stephanie, blaming pressure, blaming social expectations, blaming everything except his own choices. He had chosen to exclude me. He had chosen to lie about the finances. He had chosen to humiliate me in front of strangers. Those were his decisions made by an adult man who was old enough to get married, and I was tired of listening to him avoid responsibility for them. I told him that night that we would talk when he was ready to have an honest conversation about what had happened and why, but that I was not going to enable his dishonesty or disrespect any longer. By midnight, the wedding was effectively over. Most of the guests had left after the vendors began removing equipment and canceling services. Stephanie was in tears, her parents were furious, and Marcus was finally beginning to understand that actions have consequences. The last call I received was from Marcus himself, not asking me to fix anything, but asking if he could come over the next day to talk. For the first time all evening, his voice carried genuine remorse rather than panic or anger. I told him he was welcome to visit, but only if he was prepared to have an honest conversation about our relationship and his behavior. 2 weeks later, Marcus and I had the longest and most honest conversation we'd had since he was a child. He came to my apartment alone, looking exhausted and defeated. The confident young man who had told me to leave his wedding was gone, replaced by someone who seemed to finally understand what he had lost and what he had done to damage the most important relationship in his life. Marcus admitted that he had allowed Stephanie to convince him that his background was something to be ashamed of. She had painted a picture of his childhood as impoverished and embarrassing his mother as an obstacle to his social advancement. Gradually, he had begun to see our life together through her eyes rather than his own. The small apartment we had shared became a source of humiliation rather than pride. The sacrifices I had made became evidence of our lower social status rather than proof of love and determination. He told me about conversations where Stephanie had expressed concern about introducing him to her friends and family, worried that our modest circumstances would reflect poorly on his prospects for advancement in his career. She had convinced him that successful people came from successful families, and that his association with poverty and struggle would hold him back professionally and socially. But the wedding disaster had forced Marcus to confront some difficult truths about the choices he had made and the person he was becoming. When the payments were canceled and the vendors left, Stephanie's family had been furious with him for misleading them about his financial situation. They had assumed that someone with such expensive wedding plans must have substantial family wealth behind him. When they discovered that he had been using his mother's credit card without permission, their opinion of him changed dramatically and permanently. Stephanie herself had been devastated by the wedding's collapse, but what hurt her more was learning that Marcus had lied to her about paying for everything himself. She felt betrayed and embarrassed, unable to face her friends and family after such a public disaster. The foundation of their relationship, built on his attempt to appear more successful and independent than he actually was, had crumbled completely when the truth came to light. The aftermath had been brutal. Stephanie's parents had demanded a full accounting of the financial arrangements, leading to revelations about just how much Marcus depended on resources he had access to through me. His new in-laws, who had initially welcomed him as a successful young professional, now saw him as a fraud who had manipulated their daughter and deceived their entire family. Marcus asked if I would consider giving them another chance. Not just him, but both of them. Stephanie wanted to apologize in person and to try to build a real relationship with me. She had realized that her embarrassment about my background said more about her own insecurities than it did about any actual shortcomings on my part. They were hoping to have a small ceremony at my apartment, something simple and genuine that honored both families rather than trying to impress anyone. I had to think carefully about his request. The hurt he had caused was deep and real, and I wasn't sure it could be completely healed. The damage to our relationship would take time and effort to repair, and I needed to be confident that he truly understood what he had done wrong and was committed to changing. But looking at my son sitting in the living room where he had done his homework and shared his dreams, I remembered why I had made all those sacrifices in the first place. Not so he would owe me something forever, but so he would have the chance to become a good man. And good men learn from their mistakes. They take responsibility for their actions and work to make amends when they hurt people they love. The Marcus sitting in my living room that day was beginning to show signs of becoming that kind of man. 3 months later, we did have that second wedding. 20 people in my living room, including some of my longtime catering clients who had become like family over the years. Stephanie's parents attended looking somewhat uncomfortable, but making genuine efforts to connect with me and understand the life that had shaped their son-in-law. The food was prepared by me with help from Marcus and Stephanie, who spent the morning chopping vegetables and learning family recipes. Stephanie wore a simple dress she bought from a department store and helped me serve the guests instead of sitting like a queen receiving tribute. Marcus made a speech about the importance of family and the mistakes he had learned from acknowledging publicly that his success was built on foundations laid by people who loved him unconditionally. It wasn't the elaborate celebration they had originally planned, but it was real and warm and filled with genuine love. The experience taught all of us important lessons about love and boundaries and respect. I learned that loving someone doesn't mean accepting their poor treatment, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is enforce consequences for unacceptable behavior. Marcus learned that you can't build a new life by rejecting the people who gave you the foundation for that life, and that authentic success comes from being proud of where you came from rather than ashamed of it. Stephanie learned that family isn't about status or appearances, but about the people who show up for you when things get difficult. She began to understand that the strength and resilience she admired in Marcus had been developed through the challenges we faced together, not despite them. Looking back now, I realize that canceling those wedding payments was the best decision I could have made. Not because I wanted to punish my son, but because he needed to understand that love without respect isn't really love at all. Sometimes, the people we care about most need to learn our worth the hard way. And sometimes, we need to show them that boundaries aren't walls built to keep people out, but foundations that keep relationships strong and healthy. Marcus and Stephanie have been married now for 6 months, and our relationship has slowly healed and grown stronger than it was before. They visit regularly, help with my catering business when they can, and include me in their plans and decisions. Stephanie calls me Mom now and genuinely seems to mean it. They're talking about starting a family soon, and I'm excited about the prospect of being a grandmother to children who will grow up understanding the value of family loyalty and mutual respect. What would you have done in my situation? Have you ever had to set difficult boundaries with family members who took your love for granted? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to like this video if it resonated with you. Subscribe for more stories about family relationships and the complicated lessons we learn along the way. Share this video with someone who might need to hear about the importance of standing up for yourself, even with the people you love most. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember that standing up for yourself isn't selfish, it's necessary. I hope your own family relationships are built on mutual respect and genuine love.